Sit and stand. I'm going to stand. Is standing okay?
Yes. No problem. ¿Te gusta? Voy a poner una cortina de cuenta encima. Sí, en la computadora en cuanto termine, ya inicias presentando.
30 segundos.
30 segundos. Okay. Thank you so much.
Buenos días. En nombre del Seminario Universitario de Evolución, les doy la bienvenida a los presentes aquí en la sala y también a los que están de manera virtual. Hoy tenemos una conferencia, una más de las que ha organizado el Seminario Universitario de Evolución, sobre perspectivas evolucionistas contemporáneas. Y bueno, hoy tenemos el placer de contar con dos historiadores muy productivos en este campo de la historia de la biología, sobre todo en el tema de la herencia. Está con nosotros el doctor Carlos López Beltrán y el doctor Gregory Radick, quien nos hará una presentación sobre su última publicación sobre los temas de la herencia y después algunos comentarios del doctor Carlos López Beltrán. Bueno, me voy a permitir presentarles a nuestro invitado de honor, a Greg. Él es profesor, historiador y filósofo de la ciencia, especializado en historia de las ciencias biológicas, humanas y modernas. Se formó en historia en la Universidad de Rutgers, en Nueva Jersey, en 1992, en historia y filosofía de la ciencia, después en la Universidad de Cambridge, en donde hizo un máster en filosofía en 1996, y en el 2000 el doctorado también en la misma área. Bueno, Greg ha trabajado desde hace años en la Universidad de Leeds, en Inglaterra, prácticamente desde el 2000, tiene 24 años trabajando en esa universidad. Ha sido director del Centro de Historia y Filosofía de la Ciencia del 2006 al 2008 y director del Instituto de Investigación en Humanidades de la Universidad de Leeds. Bueno, ha publicado numerosos trabajos sobre historia de la biología, con énfasis en el darwinismo, Darwin, genética, eugenesia, ciencias de la mente, el lenguaje y el comportamiento. Sin más, Greg, many thanks for your talk and welcome to the UNM.
Muchas gracias, Ricardo y Carlos, y buenos días a todos. Me encanta visitar la UNAM, and I am the more grateful for this opportunity to share my work with you. My first job was as a teacher of English as a foreign language, so I hope that I can reconnect to my past and speak slowly and clearly for those of you for whom English is your second language. Again, thank you for the opportunity. I want to begin with an observation about genetics now. And this was something that I saw at first hand last week at the annual conference of the American Society for Human Genetics in Denver, where the president, Bruce Gelb, who you can see there, used his presidential address in order to raise concerns about how simplicity and complexity in genetics gets framed in 2024. And what I want to do today is to trace those concerns right back to the beginnings of the science in the early 20th century, back to a ferocious debate that broke out over the question of whether it was clarifying or misleading to frame our knowledge about inheritance around the simple sorts of traits that Gregor Mendel highlighted in his extraordinary paper of 1866 on crossbred peas. Traits, as we are reminded in this image, which come as cleanly differentiated binaries, round or wrinkled, yellow or green, where the phenotypic differences, the character differences, are explained entirely in terms of genotypic differences. And what I want to suggest to you is that there is a lot of received wisdom in this area, which is ripe for challenge. I also hope to suggest along the way the value of the history of science, not just as a record of what happened in the past, but as a repository of possibilities. Some of them realized, some of them not realized, but worthy a second look.
Yes, I mean,
Sure.
voy a volver a contar. ¿Ya caí? Ya caí. Sí, ya. Sorry.
Oh, no. Okay, so the debate that I want to talk about involved many people, but principally it involved these two men, seen here around the year 1890, when they were about 30 years old. They were friends who were becoming frenemies, who were soon to become full-on enemies. On the left is William Bateson, who was based at Cambridge and who, after the 1900 rediscovery of Mendel, became the greatest and most influential champion of Mendel that there ever was. You may know that the term genetics was invented by Bateson. On the right is W.F.R. Weldon. His full name was Walter Frank Raphael Weldon. He was known as Raphael. And by 1900, he was based at Oxford. He took an interest immediately in the buzz growing around Mendel's paper, but he quickly became skeptical about the generality of Mendel's findings. And if we want a visual analogy to capture the differences between these two men over Mendel, I think we can do worse than to think about a window and a mirror. For Bateson, what Mendel had done in the garden of the monastery in Brunn was to clear away all of the confusion and the clutter that had blocked the vision of previous investigators. And in doing that, he opened a window onto inheritance at its most basic. This is a view of Mendel's paper which is familiar to us because it's the one preserved in our textbooks. For Weldon, by contrast, although he admired Mendel's work in a limited way, overall, he judged that Mendel's results mirrored back to him, reflected back to him, the experimental choices that he had made at the start. Choices about which varieties to include and which to exclude. Choices about which traits to focus on and which to ignore. Choices about which conditions to grow the plants under. In Weldon's view, had Mendel made different choices, he might have ended up with different, even opposite results. And Weldon made these points vividly and, from Bateson's point of view, infuriatingly in a paper that he published in February 1902, a critical paper entitled Mendel's Laws of Alternative Inheritance in Peas. And it is mostly about peas, but traits in other organisms do get a look, including at one point eye color in humans. Here's what Weldon had to say. It would almost certainly be possible, by selecting cases of marriage between men and women of appropriate ancestry, to demonstrate for their families a law of dominance of dark over light eye color, or of light over dark. Such a law might be as valid for the families of selected ancestry as Mendel's laws are for his peas, and for other peas of probably similar ancestral history. But it would fail when applied to dark and light-eyed parents in general. That is, to parents of any ancestry, and I can't quite see behind that, but I think what it says is that is to parents of any ancestry who have eyes of a given color, right? So the point is you make your choices and you generate your pattern. And it's arbitrary to declare one pattern the natural pattern, says Weldon. But when it comes to peas, his paper included a rare for the time color photograph of hybrid peas collected from commercial breeders. And if you have a look at the very top row, in box number 1, we see peas that are unambiguously green. In box number 6, peas that are unambiguously yellow. That's as per Mendel. But in between, contra Mendel, we see a spectrum, a graded continuum, from yellowy green through to greeny yellow. As the science writer Kat Arney said, 50 shades of pea. And this point about how Mendelian binaries are carved out of natural continua is one that generalized, Weldon thought. And he made this point in a letter that he wrote to his friend and ally, Carl Pearson, later that year in June 1902. Here's the diagram, and here's what Weldon said. What all Mendelians do is to take the diagram of frequency and to call a range AB one character, and the range BC the other character of a Mendelian pair. A brief plug here for the book that Ricardo mentioned. I've taken this image from my book, Disputed Inheritance, The Battle Over Mendel and the Future of Biology. And we'll be talking more about it. There, I suggest that the program that Weldon develops between the years 1902 and 1906, his alternative to Mendelism, can be fairly characterized in terms of three key themes or three key emphases. Let me take you through them one by one. First, variation. In Weldon's view, we should want a science of inheritance which is true to variation as we actually observe it, not a fictionalized, idealized oversimplification. That's the first point. Second key theme, ancestry. For Weldon, it was important that individuals don't just inherit determinants for this trait or this or that trait. They inherit a vast assembly of determinants, what we now call genetic background. And differences in the genetic background can change the expression of a particular trait. The background of factors, all of the chanciness that comes in development, all of that and more for Weldon constituted an internal environment around chromosomes. But there was also, and this is the third theme, the third emphasis, external environments, physicochemical environments. They are also a source of variability. So variation, ancestry, environments, that's what matters from Weldon's view, and that's what's being marginalized within a Mendelian science. So where should you start? What is at the center? What kind of a pattern do you begin with if you have Weldon's preoccupations? Not Mendel's P's, plainly, but what? Well, when Weldon addressed a general audience on the subject of inheritance, he started them off with this organism. Does anyone recognize it? My biologists?
Daphnia.
Daphnia, the water flea, Daphnia. Bueno. Weldon told his audience about experiments done in his laboratory by a former student with Daphnia. And what happened was that as the water in which the Daphnia were raised became polluted with their wastes, the spines of the Daphnia began to shrink until eventually you get Daphnia born that are spineless. However, says Weldon, if you take a spineless Daphnia and remove it to clean water, its offspring will be fully spined. Furthermore, the length of the fully spined Daphnia, on average, will be different depending on which variety of Daphnia you've taken your individuals from. So here's what Weldon said to his audience, at least according to a manuscript that I found in the archive in London from this lecture. He said to his audience, now clearly the condition of the spine is not exclusively acquired, and it is not exclusively inherited. It belongs to both categories. A Daphnia of certain ancestry, growing in a solution of certain chemical composition, has a spine of a certain length. We see here, said Weldon in 1902, the complex way in which the characters of an organism are determined by the interaction of the two sets of factors, the environmental and the ancestral. Now, 7 years later, a German biologist named Richard Volterek, also studying Daphnia, turned these points into a lovely graph. And in doing so, produced what he enduringly called norm of reaction curves. So what are we looking at here? On the y-axis, we have the phenotype, values of the phenotype. On the x-axis, we have the environment. So in this case, it's head length on the y-axis and richness of nutrients on the x-axis. Each curve, A, B, and C, represents a different genotype, or as it may be here, a different variety. So what you see at a glance with a norm of reaction diagram is that phenotypes are the variable upshots of particular genotypes responding to particular environments. It's worth pausing here to contrast the counterpart emblem of the Mendelian framing of heredity, the Punnett square. Reginald Punnett was one of Bateson's allies at Cambridge. Right? The Punnett square, as I emphasized at the start, in which characters are blockily binary, and where the causation is exclusively genetic. Nothing matters except combinations of alleles. So we have here two really quite different framings, two different options, two alternatives for what counts as central, exemplary, primary, when we think about knowledge of inheritance, and what is secondary, peripheral, exceptional. Now, it may be that there were good reasons for the Punnett square framing to be favored in the early 20th century. But if there were good reasons, they were not decisive. What decided the issue was an accident of history, the death in 1906, at the age of 46, of the otherwise robustly healthy Weldon. With the book that he was working on, setting out his alternative perspective, which he almost finished, uncompleted and unfinished and unpublished. And so by default, we get the organization, the framing of knowledge that we're familiar with, where everybody anchors on Punnett square patterns, and the more complex stuff, like norm of reaction curves, is off on the periphery. No one is in denial about the complexities, but they're not central. They're not what you're taught first. They're not what people remember when they leave the classroom. They remember dominance, recessiveness, blue eyes, brown eyes, maybe the 3-to-1 ratio. But if you know about Weldon, and you know how close the alternative possibility came to being a reality, it's natural enough to ask, well, what if? What if he lived that little bit longer, had lived to publish that book, and it went on to have some influence in the world? What would things have been like if the first thing you learn about genetics is about interaction, is about norm of reaction diagrams? What if people anchored on that? And they regarded Punnett square patterns as interesting precisely because they're exceptional. They're unusual. They are what you get when all of the variability and all the sources of variability that usually exist are stripped away. And you can learn things from a stripped down system of inheritance, but that's what it is. What if that had happened? Well, I think that question about a Weldonian reframing would be an interesting what if question to pose any time. But I think now it's an especially interesting question because of developments in 3 areas: in genetics, in science education, and in cognitive science. Let me touch on each of them briefly. First, genetics. I mentioned at the start that Bruce Gell used his presidential address at the American Society of Human Genetics to raise concerns with his colleagues about how simplicity and complexity are being handled. And he did that because, as he explained in his talk, the growth of sequencing and the drop in the cost of sequencing means that the information that we have on many quote unquote Mendelian disorders is no longer simply dependent on families who show up in clinics with some visible disorder. Instead, the wider population is having their genome sequenced. And the more and more that happens, the more and more that what geneticists call penetrance, the proportion of a population having a mutation and showing some version of the trait is dropping. So incomplete penetrance and variable expressivity, which is the range of ways that the trait expresses itself in people who show any version of it. Incomplete penetrance and variable expressivity is becoming more and more prominent for clinical geneticists. It's something they need to think harder about. What I want to draw your attention to myself is this image. I take this from a recent presentation by the biological anthropologist Benedict Halgrimsson, who's based at the University of Calgary. And it illustrates his view that Mendelian disorders should be seen as extreme expressions of developmental potentials with polygenic bases. And now, if you're looking at that diagram and thinking to yourself, hey, wait a minute, I've seen that before. You're right. we saw pretty much exactly that diagram in Weldon's letter to Carl Pearson in 1902. When I pointed this out to Benedict, he was, to say the least, surprised and wanted to buy my book. But I mention it to you because it underscores the sense in which this moment is a rich one for revisiting these past options for the framing of genetics. So genetic knowledge. So that's genetics. Let me turn secondly to science education. And here, some of the most brilliant work has been done by Brian Donovan, who I'm delighted to say is a collaborator of mine, is based in Colorado. And some years ago, Brian did a study in which he tracked the students who undertook the standard lesson, where the teacher took the students from Mendel's peas to Mendelian recessive disorders in humans associated with particular populations. So Tay-Sachs disease with people of Jewish Ashkenazi background, cystic fibrosis for people of white European background, sickle cell disease for people of Black African background. And what Brian found is that those students emerged from those lessons with their Punnett square problem-solving skills improved, but they also emerged from them with an exaggerated sense of the homogeneity of the human races, with exaggerated pessimism about being able to close gaps in educational attainment between the races. They even came away less willing to socialize across racial lines. In work that Brian and his colleagues published earlier this year in Science, he showed that wherever in a curriculum you drop standard issue elementary Mendelism, you get an uptick in racist attitudes among the students. So all of that, again, emphasizes the sense that there's something worth revisiting here. Finally, cognitive science. Earlier this summer, Marina Dubova, who is now a postdoctoral fellow at the Santa Fe Institute for Complexity, and a number of colleagues published this fascinating paper on simplicity and complexity, right? Entitled, "Is Occam's Razor Losing Its Edge? New Perspectives on the Principle of Model Parsimony." Because many of us take for granted that, of course, when you're at the start, whether you're a researcher or a student, it's always best to start with the very simplest models, and only then gradually to build in complexity. And what Marina and her colleagues argue, I think persuasively, is that that's not necessarily true. Sometimes it's best to start with the simplest possible model, especially in situations when you are confident that you are not simplifying away relationships that might turn out to be crucial. In other circumstances where you can't be confident of that, more complex models, which are better able to bring out rich structure in the data, prove to be more productive. Start with a more complex model, which captures that rich structure, and use the more complex model to generate simpler models from there, simpler models which are informed by the background complexity. So a brilliant provocation from cognitive science, unsettling our sense that it's always best to start simple, not necessarily. Sometimes it's better to begin with complexity and then move to simplicity. Well, given all of this, I'm the more pleased to tell you that some years back, my colleagues at Leeds and I actually did an experiment, putting all of this to the test when it comes to Mendelian versus a Weldonian, right? A simplicity first versus a complexity first framing of genetic knowledge. So in running our experiment, we thought, well, it would be great to go back into the past and intervene, but that's not possible. So what can we do? Well, we thought, let's imagine that we now have genetics textbooks that come from the Weldonian past that might have been, what would they look like? I mean, they wouldn't start kids off with Mendel's peas and then complexify it. Maybe they would begin with something like the role that a gene plays in the condition of a human heart. That's going to be a multifactorial story. It's going to be complex, not complicated, not hard, but there'll be 12 factors easily that you want to be thinking about when you're thinking about the condition of a human heart. And the causal swirl will change over the course of an individual's lifetime. And it will matter what their racial ethnic background is, what their class, socioeconomic class is, because socioeconomic class goes along with stress, and stress levels affect cardiovascular condition. We want all of that in the picture, along with genes, in a sense that genes sometimes, rarely, affect hearts directly, but they affect lots of other things indirectly, which affect the condition of hearts. So let's suppose we could start students thinking about genes and bodies, genotypes and phenotypes with that kind of an example. That's our exemplar. And we go on from there to emphasize interaction. Interaction of genes with genes, genes with environments of all kinds throughout the course at every moment. So that by the time students reach Mendelian patterns, they see them as interesting precisely because they're unusual. They are the special case. And their curiosity is excited about them because they're unlike everything else that they've seen. So suppose we could teach that course, we could find students who want to take it. What would they be like at the end of teaching? In particular, might they be less deterministic about genes than students coming out of a traditional Start with Mendel course? Well, we ran the experiment and then we reported the results, we being myself, my colleague Jenny Lewis, and also a brilliant postdoc that we hired, Annie Jameson, who had been a developmental biologist and became a historian of science. So she was just perfect for this role. And we reported the results first in Nature, informally in 2016, and then more formally in 2017 in the journal Science and Education. And what we found was that whereas on average, students coming out of the traditional Mendelian course were as deterministic about genes at the end of teaching as they were at the start, maybe even more so. Students coming out of our experimental Weldonian course were less deterministic about genes at the end of teaching. And at least among the genetics educators that I spend time with, that is a win. Right? The more you learn about genetics, the less confident you should be that you can just read off phenotype from genotype. And since that experiment, I've been collaborating with, I mentioned Brian Donovan and also Michelle Smith at Cornell in an NSF-funded study, which is trying both to rigorize what we did at Leeds by transforming the experiment into a set of randomized controlled trials, but also to get at, and this is difficult, some of the psychology underlying all of this. And so these connections here are hypothesized, but I think they're plausible. Connections between categorical thinking, thinking about peas in terms of green or yellow, round or wrinkled. Stereotyping, thinking of people in terms of kinds. And the way that that in turn feeds into racism, sexism, ableism, other forms of prejudice. And finally, what psychologists call a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. A fixed mindset being the mindset which says, I can't change, you can't change, the world can't change, things just are the way they are. And a growth mindset being the opposite of that. Now, when we ran this experiment initially at Leeds, although I did this as a historian of science, right? interested precisely in the question of what might have been, I didn't actually include history in the class. We left out the history of the Bateson-Weldon debate on the view that it would be a confounding variable. Right? We wanted to test this curriculum as if it dropped from the skies, just like the alternative Mendelian curriculum. It's only been other people, science educators, who have picked up on our work, who have helped me see that actually the history belongs in there along with the revised curriculum. I was first notified about this from a paper that was published in 2020 by biology educators at Illinois State University. You see there the title, Using Culturally Relevant Pedagogy to Reconsider the Genetics Canon. And if you have a look there at the first line under the introduction, it begins, African Americans, Latinx, Native Americans, and Pacific Islanders together comprise 32.2% of the US population, but these proportions are not reflected among the STEM workforce. So you see where they're coming from. Let me quote a little bit from the paper on why the history that I've reconstructed belongs in the alternative Weldonian curriculum. They say, reflecting upon the history of the development of our genetics knowledge would require instructors to be aware of and teach about the culturally laden history of Mendel, Weldon, and Bateson, which may create discomfort in some instructors. However, we argue that it is entirely appropriate to include this history, as we often teach about the history of scientific knowledge and the discovery of things like the double helix, atomic structure, evolution, and numerous other scientific concepts. Shying away from the impacts of culture on scientific knowledge only serves to reinforce deterministic, essentialist, and racist views of human genetics. It is far more appropriate to embrace the complexity and context-dependent nature of science and education of genetics itself, to promote, it must be something like greater awareness, and to move toward culturally relevant genetics education. So this is coming from the educators themselves. So that was the first time that I heard that message and that music. The second time came from a wonderful collaboration that I've had with people at the Exploratorium, the famous science museum in San Francisco. They had a project on how you should teach about genetics in a world in which Mendelian patterns, again, had come to be seen as exceptional rather than exemplary. They interviewed me for a film from about 2 hours. They took about 30 seconds of usable material. The rest of the film is entirely the work of a brilliant filmmaker. And I want to show it to you now because it takes this big book and brings it down to 3 minutes. Unfortunately, we couldn't get the audio to work, so I'll have to narrate it for you. But you should still get something of the flavor. Oh, it's showing just because, okay.
Bueno, no tiene sonido porque tenemos unos problemas con audio, pero sí pueden ir checando los subtítulos, por favor.
Okay, thanks. So let's see if I can read it back. Okay, so you are one of a kind. Who you are today is a result of influences that include your genes, your environment, your life experiences and habits. Increasingly, we live in a world where we're going to be confronting information about genetics, about our own genomes, and about the genomes of others. And we're going to have to be able to interpret that information. But our understanding today has been colored by an influential experiment, the scientific controversy it caused, and an untimely death. Now you hear monkish music. The story begins in an unlikely place, in the garden of a monastery in Eastern Europe. In the mid-1800s, a monk named Gregory began a careful, crossbreeding experiment with pea plants. After 8 years and 28,000 plants, Mendel concluded there were factors passed down in a neat and modular way from parents to offspring that determined visible traits, like peas that grew tall or short, that had yellow peas or green. Now we call those factors genes. He published a paper about his experiment in 1866. It sparked a scientific controversy 35 years later. Mere grumble, 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 grumble. One group thought Mendel had figured out the fundamental truth of how inheritance works, that genes determine visible traits. The other group, led by W.F.R. Weldon, argued that the environment was just as important as genes in shaping an organism's traits over its lifetime. He observed that things like temperature, soil quality, and other environmental conditions caused a lot of variation. Looking at nature, Weldon saw that traits did not fall into tidy categories, but were more of a continuum with lots of in-between forms. Weldon set out to prove his point in a paper that included a rare for the time color photograph of peas, produced by expert plant breeders. It showed many shades of color, from bright green to lemon yellow, not just the two colors Mendel described. Before he could make his full case, though, Weldon died unexpectedly, and the controversy settled by default. The Mendelians won. The outcome has meant for over 100 years, on page 1 of Genetics 101, we teach Mendel's genetic determinism. Even though we get to variation in environmental factors eventually, first impressions often leave a lingering and mistaken impression with students that our genes are our destiny. Thinking about the living world, including us, in terms of tidy categories can lead to mistakes. And those mistakes in turn can lead to prejudice, because people don't just come in kinds, whether that's in terms of sex or gender or race. People are individuals, and they need to be thought about and treated as individuals. We now know, as Weldon thought, that heredity is not destiny. The genes that you carry express themselves in contexts. And if you change the context, you can change, often, the effect of the gene. So when you think about inheritance, in my view, you're much better off going back to Weldon's peas than to Mendel's. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Greg. Ahora, Carlos hará una participación y después tendremos 20 minutos para preguntas y respuestas, comentarios. Me presento al doctor Carlos López Beltrán, es investigador de aquí del Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas desde 1992. Carlos es especializado en el estudio de la historia y filosofía de las ciencias de la vida. Su trayectoria también es muy diversa, pero sobre todo ha enfatizado sus reflexiones sobre la noción de herencia, tanto en sentido fisiológico como biológico. Prácticamente ha sido gran parte de su investigación, su producción bibliográfica, etcétera, empezando con su tesis de doctorado sobre herencia humana entre 1750 y 1860, que fue defendida en el King's College de Londres, y bueno, el tutor es una amiga en común de los tres, el doctor Jonathan Koch, un especialista y experto en historia de la biología. Y bueno, Carlos complementa su labor de investigación con su participación en los posgrados, da clases en la Facultad de Filosofía, en la Facultad de Ciencias, también a nivel de licenciatura. Ha tenido diferentes instancias de investigación en Francia, en el Centro Nacional de Investigación Científica de París, en Max Planck en Berlín, en la Universidad Autónoma de Madrid y en el Instituto de Estudios Superiores de Monterrey, en la Ciudad de México. Bueno, Carlos, también te agradezco.
No, gracias.
Y adelante.
I'm going to say a few words in English so you can understand me, and then I'm going to switch Spanish. Welcome to your home. This is the people. That's the Mexican finesse, but I like to state it. Your presentation was perfect because it set the ground for what I'm going to say, and I think we'll have a very good conversation. I hope. Gracias. Thank you very much, Ricardo, Rosaura, and everybody who had a part in this organizing your visit. The Seminario de Evolución. Seminario Universitario de Evolución, which is this recent idea that Ricardo and Rosaura put together in order to carry on thinking about the history and the importance of evolutionary thought in our world. And it was a very good idea to profit from the fact that you were passing near to have you here. Welcome. Ahora paso al español. Voy a hablar despacio para que Greg me entienda. Yo lo que voy a hacer es hablar del libro. Este libro, que es sin duda un libro muy importante, al que invito a todos a que lean, si no lo han leído ya. Espero que muy pronto tengamos una traducción al español. También es algo que el seminario podría hacer. Porque creo que tiene, por muchas razones, ya las empezaron a ver en la presentación espléndida que hizo Greg, situando un poco los puntos nodales de su trabajo. Tengo un texto breve que escribí y al final del cual voy a hacerle algunas preguntas directamente a Greg sobre el libro, ¿no? Y sobre lo que implicó hacerlo. Entonces, sin más, voy a leer el texto. Voy a revisitar varios de los puntos que ella mencionó, pero un poco dirigidos a contarles cómo está desplegada en el libro esta información, de las cuales nos ha dado ya algunos elementos. Este libro, Disputed Inheritance, que apareció, which year? 2 years ago?
Last year.
Last year, el año pasado. I've been so familiarized with it that I think it's several years, but it's only 1 year. Por cierto, tuvimos en Oxford durante el año pasado un grupo de lectura organizado por nuestro amigo común Alex Aylward, en donde leímos línea por línea y discutimos con un grupo de estudiantes y de colegas el libro. Entonces, y tuvimos la ventaja de que en la última sesión Greg vino a Oxford desde Leeds y tuvimos una discusión bastante rica. So we had a reading group around it, organized by Alex, which was really amazing. Bueno, este libro es indispensable para ubicar la raíz conceptual y práctica de los enredos y tribulaciones por los que transitó la genética durante el siglo XX. Se sitúa históricamente en un nodo crucial que los historiadores ya habíamos dado por explicado: la polémica famosa biometristas contra Mendeliano, o el bando de Weldon Pearson contra el bando de Bateson y sus amigos, ¿sí? Y usando otros elementos de los que usarían o han usado historiadores tradicionales, mendelianos también ellos,
o los sociólogos y filósofos de la subdeterminación, muestra cómo, y es uno de los puntos importantes que ella mencionó, cómo el desenlace de la polémica, el triunfo eventual del mendelismo batesoniano, que marcaría profundamente el siglo XX, no solo no era inevitable, sino que las cosas pudieron seguir un derrotero alternativo, pluralista, no reduccionista y menos determinista en las ciencias de la herencia y la variación biológica. Descubrimos con la lectura atenta de este libro que la carrera científica de Weldon, Raphael Weldon, fue no solo brillante, sino una de las mejor documentadas a través de cartas, manuscritos y publicaciones varias de la historia de la biología. Es una de las riquezas del libro, es el uso maravilloso que hace de un acervo archivístico muy impresionante. En su momento climático, este libro nos lleva de modo casi novelesco, y lo habrán sentido ustedes en la presentación, a la lamentación, al duelo por la muerte repentina de Weldon cuando estaba a punto de terminar y publicar su obra cumbre, que se iba a llamar probablemente una teoría de la herencia, en la que sintetizaba Weldon sus investigaciones experimentales y las de muchos otros de décadas, y argumentaba ferozmente por no ceder todo el terreno a las prácticas teórico-experimentales que imponía el mendelismo, sobre todo a la tendencia a objetivar y reificar los factores genéticos en causas simples de rasgos y caracteres unitarios, lo que nos ha estado contando hoy. El libro es como se dice, tour de force, ceñido y riguroso por los episodios más relevantes que llevaron a la comunidad de biólogos teóricos y experimentales entre 1890 y 1910 aproximadamente a construir una estrategia de investigación, una serie de abordajes analíticos productivos que lo sacaran de las marañas en las que la investigación previa de la transmisión hereditaria de rasgos en todo tipo de organismos, silvestres, domesticados, animales, vegetales, terrestres, marinos, etcétera, organismos con los cuales en ese periodo los biólogos estaban experimentando o observando en la naturaleza la transmisión hereditaria, y esas observaciones los había metido en este berenjenal, ¿no? Y un poco este periodo es cuando el esfuerzo es por aclarar un poco esa ventana que nos mostró, ¿no? Producir una mirada un poco más nítida hacia el paisaje, ¿no? La herencia y la variación, tanto en el contexto de los debates postdarwinistas como en el de la embriología y la taxonomía organísmica, así como en el terreno de la producción agropecuaria, se habían convertido en nociones cruciales en urgente necesidad de clarificación. Y en ese periodo los biólogos más ambiciosos, incluidos Bateson y Weldon, que son los dos protagonistas del libro, aspiraban a participar en esta clarificación, ¿no? Las contribuciones nodales de científicos como Weissman o Galton o Pearson, de Vries, Brooks, etcétera, etcétera, una decena de otros biólogos, son situadas y contextualizadas a la vez que analizadas con lucidez y gracia por Radick en este libro, pero sobre todo lo son las trayectorias paralelas de, como ya dije, William Bateson y Raphael Weldon. Ambos grandes biólogos ya habían pasado de una estrecha amistad y colaboración a una situación de tensión y rivalidad dinamizada por la competencia obligada, por una economía de escasos recursos y escasos reconocimientos a disputarse entre científicos británicos eminentes del periodo. Competían uno con el otro por ver quién obtenían más pronto y mejores reconocimientos. Esto ya había pasado antes de que sus diferencias teóricas, experimentales, evidenciales, filosóficas, cristalizaran en torno a la irrupción del trabajo de Mendel en la escena inglesa y europea alrededor del cambio de siglo, el famoso redescubrimiento de Mendel que está en todos los libros de historia de la biología. Las disyuntivas entre variación discontinua y variación continua, entre transformación a saltos o transformación por grados, entre determinantes hereditarios atómicos o múltiples, multifactoriales, pudieron plantearse con nitidez y sobre todo las estrategias de investigación a adoptar para sortear la causalidad en la transmisión y lograr la estabilización de las propiedades deseables, hicieron que los ánimos de enfrentamiento y la consolidación de frentes candentes de batalla se enconaran. O sea, esta animadversión ríspida que describe con el lujo de detalles y de formas a veces hasta emocionales importantes, Greg en el libro. Los esfuerzos de Galton, de Pearson y de otros por evitar el choque de trenes no resistieron el vigor de pionero de Bateson y su encono personal contra Weldon, y el mismo Weldon tuvo que entrar vigorosamente en la lid. Digamos, en los capítulos del inicio del libro, donde va relatando cómo se va enconando más y más, y sobre todo haciendo un uso muy virtuoso de las cartas y las reflexiones que cada uno de ellos está teniendo, va produciendo, como ya dije, una especie de efecto novelístico, ¿no? La cosa se va caldeando y se va poniendo interesante, además que intelectualmente es apasionante. Y habría salido airoso, y el mismo Weldon tuvo que entrar vigorosamente en la lid, y habría salido airoso, según especula con mucho fundamento Radick en el libro, si la muerte no le hubiera jugado una mala pasada. Al menos habría conseguido que la mendelización de la genética hubiera sido menos drástica, con capítulos importantes para las maneras alternativas de producirse de los organismos y de sus rasgos que consideraran las restricciones del desarrollo y la multiplicidad de causas y contextos, lo que nos estuvo con toda claridad explicando hace un rato. Pero Disputed Inheritance no solo es un gran libro histórico que cambiará para siempre nuestra comprensión de esos episodios, es también un admirable ejercicio de reflexión y análisis historiográfico. Se toma los trabajos del autor de preguntarse por qué hemos entendido el pasado de ciertos modos y no de otros. Se pregunta por los sesgos que los historiadores y sociólogos y filósofos de la ciencia hemos introducido en nuestras lecturas del pasado. ¿Por qué, por ejemplo, culpamos a Galton y luego a los mendelianos de la eugenesia y no vemos contextos más amplios que redistribuyen la responsabilidad? Pudo la eugenesia ser efecto de muchas otras causas, pudieron otras teorías haberla apuntalado, ¿no? Entonces, entre otras cosas, es uno de los elementos historiográficos interesantes que encontramos en este libro. ¿Por qué condenamos el reduccionismo o el determinismo sin antes analizar lo que decimos? Y se pregunta también, en una tercera beta valiosa, por cómo hemos entre todos permitido que el siglo XX entronizara o endiosara en la conciencia popular al ADN y al gene como la llave maestra de todo lo que ocurre a los organismos. Una de las claves de esta pregunta la tiene, según Radick, y debemos coincidir, la enseñanza básica y la divulgación popular de las nociones de genética que parten siempre de Mendel y sus corolarios principales, sus nociones como dominancia, recesividad, alelos, etcétera, etcétera, que nos imponen luego la ubicua noción del gene para o del gen de, y podrían estas no haberse instalado en el lugar de honor de los temarios y todavía podrían ser desplazadas hacia ahí. Todo esto apunta a algo en lo que Greg ha sido pionero y entre los historiadores, y es darle su peso a lo que muchos llaman la historia contrafáctica, ¿no? Que algunas gentes rechazan como poco seria o poco aceptable, y sin embargo, este libro es una muestra que un buen ejercicio de historia contrafáctica, el hubiera, sí existe, ¿no? Y es un poco uno de los elementos importantes. Una biología weldonizada, una genética alternativa, nos podría muy plausiblemente haber traído a los tiempos actuales de la molecularización y las redes complejas de causalidad genética, epigenética, genómica, proteómica, etcétera, sin necesidad de esa estancia prolongada de varias décadas en el genocentrismo. Radick describe en este libro cómo la historia de la genética también puede contribuir robustamente a una mejor pedagogía, y que es un poco lo que en la segunda parte de su charla nos ha mostrado brillantemente. Ese sería mi texto. Now I'm going to ask you a couple of questions before we pass the word. O no sé si tienes alguna. ¿Está bien?
No, let me first thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay.
My high school Spanish means that I caught only some of it, but what I caught, I appreciated very much. And I hope you'll let me study the text later. I'm better at reading Spanish than.
I'll give you a transcription because
Yeah.
this is in
Thank you very much.
No, you're welcome. As you know, I've learned a lot from your work. I mean, this es un libro que le tomó 20 años, por lo menos 20 years, it took me. Y eso hemos ido conociendo en el tiempo algunos de los avances y algunas de las ideas, pero aquí ha puesto junto Greg pues muchos años de investigación.
So if I may some of you as graduate students will be teaching. So I had to teach a class that included the history of genetics, and I was looking for illustrations to help keep my students awake. And that's when I first saw this photograph. I didn't discover it; it wasn't new, but it was new to me. And when I first saw it, I thought, that's not what Mendel's peas are supposed to look like. There's a story there. But as Carlos said, it took me, well, a long time to work out exactly what I wanted to say about all of it. But be careful. Your graduate student days, you can learn things, you can acquire questions that stay with you a long time.
So the first question has to do with the archives.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I was fascinated. Está bien si lo hago en inglés y si no entienden, traducimos. I was fascinated by the amount of material that show up in the way you follow the day by day, almost day by day of the theoretical, experimental, and polemical developments of these episodes you describe. So, if you could tell us about the archives, where were they, and what was it working with them? The question that is lingering my mind all the time I'm reading you is: did you change your mind when faced with the evidence? Like, your book can be read as pretty Weldonian.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Although I think it's quite a fair appraisal of both Bateson and Weldon's, and both the Mendelian and the biometric fields. But I mean, anybody who who comes from the traditional narrative would say, this is too well done. Probably, I don't know. I don't think that. So that would be one question. Has anybody reacted like that? But it's more importantly, what was your process? Did you change your mind? What was it like to be doing this?
Thank you. So there are several elements in that question to pick up on. What changed my mind? It's not so much changing my mind as learning things that I didn't expect to learn, which then changed my perspective. And it wasn't so much the archive as the reconstructing for myself of the trajectory of this debate. So I always find this, and I'm sure other people in the room find this too, that when you move in time with the protagonists of your story, when you've read all of their early papers, and then you follow them through time, it's so illuminating. Because having the backstory filled in changes the way you perceive what happened next. So when it comes to archives, Weldon's papers are preserved as part of Carl Pearson's papers in an archive in London. William Bateson's papers are a little curious, but the main supply is in Cambridge. There's a full set of photocopies at something called the John Innes Institute, a plant breeding center founded by Bateson in the east of England, and a few other collections elsewhere. Francis Galton has a huge collection, and Galton is a major figure. I didn't talk about him in my presentation, but he's a major figure. So, as Carlos says, in some ways, there's an almost overwhelming amount of material. It matters more for Weldon because Weldon was one of those scientists whose published work is very thin compared with the unpublished work. So he's someone who would write 2 20-page letters in a day. And those letters would include tables with data. And they were full of insight and information and jokes and gossip. And so when one is trying to reconstruct this debate, the backstage Weldon figures more prominently than the backstage Bateson, because Bateson was a publisher. And so with Bateson, I feel I learned a lot. And I like to think that I've brought some new insights to the literature, at least as much about Bateson as I have about Weldon. So for example, in 1902, saw the publication of 2 major works, the first real Mendelian works. One that Bateson wrote with his collaborator Rebecca Saunders. The other by himself, which was an answer to Weldon's critique. And both of them are brilliant in ways that I hope in a way that one appreciates more when one sees where they've come, what they've come out of, and what sort of work they're doing, as Weldon sees it. So Bateson is sometimes famous for a one-liner, treasure your exceptions. From the point of view of my book, that's deeply ironical. Because if there's one thing Bateson did for Mendelism, it was to neutralize the power of the exceptions. And when we're there with Weldon, what we're doing is observing someone who's watching an experimental program emerge in a way that makes it invulnerable to empirical disproof. So at the beginning, Weldon, you saw that Pease photograph. Weldon thinks, I can just throw exceptions at this. No. Very, very quickly, in the way of any successful science, Bateson comes up with a whole a whole catalog of what a teacher of mine called exculpatory explanations. So explanations which say why, even though the world didn't agree with the theory, it's not a problem for the theory. Bateson was a genius at many things, but especially at exculpatory explanations. Oh, so you have a green-seeded pea in the F2, and your theory says it should only ever produce green-seeded offspring, but you've got a yellow-seeded pea. Bateson says, big deal. I've got 3 or 4 possible explanations for why that might be the case. And what this does for Weldon is that it forces him to dig deeper. Weldon realizes that just throwing counterexamples at this program is not going to stop it. And so the book manuscript that he was working on between 1904 and his death is the work of someone who's had to think really hard about how you oppose this machine that Bateson had built. This machine which is just built to run and run and run, right? Where nothing you can find empirically could disprove it. And so he comes up with the alternative that I brought out to you, where the key question is, whose conception of dominance is the more general? The Mendelian concept, in which yellowness is dominant across the board no matter what, or this more relativistic conception of dominance, in which it depends. It depends on context. And Weldon concludes in the book that the relativistic conception is more consistent with biological knowledge as of the early 20th century. So I think that way of, it's when you've seen Bateson against Weldon and Bateson through the light of Weldon that you get a new Bateson, a new appreciation for just what made him so powerful. So I very much resist the idea that it's too Weldonian. It's rather that Weldon's side of the story has never been reconstructed as an equal part of the story. But once that's done, it's a very different story.
That sets the stage for my next question. I mean, in the book, you very clearly oppose the overdetermination by social factors,
Yes,
and overdetermination by cultural factors, and you side very strongly with people who understand advancement of science as something that has more to do with the dialectics of evidence and theoretical struggles, and of course the usefulness if it produces opportunities for experiment or opportunities for applications in agronomy, things like that, and that's part of the explanation of the Mendelian success story. So the question would be, you're trying to, in a way, set the stage as if the outcome of these polemics and of the story was underdetermined, and if Weldon hadn't died, then we might have had a different theoretical equilibrium, so to speak. But one is tempted to think that I mean, for instance, you describe the enthusiasm with which agronomists and in America jumped over Bateson and his peers, and there was something in the mood that it's the kind of presences that you don't really like as explanation, but they are there. So what's your stance in this over or under determination of theoretical and experimental outcomes? And if you think it's, well, of course it's all counterfactual, but how strong do you think your argument for this underdetermination of the outcome is?
Again, thank you for a very rich set of comments and questions. You might remember at the start of my talk, I suggested that we see the history of science not just as a record of what happened, but as a repository of possibilities. I don't know what you'll think of this, but increasingly I've begun to think that among the facts about the past that historians are responsible for are the possibilities, that there are facts to be learned about what was possible in the past, and that one can bring evidence to bear on claims about those possibilities. And so one can see it, the counterfactual, so to speak. I hate that term, precisely because it suggests that when one asks about possibilities, you're leaving the realm of fact and evidence. And I've written a long book to suggest that's just not true, and it's not helpful. And it's not helpful, not least because if one asks the largest possible question, what is history for? And what are we doing? What's the point? I think it's a duty for the reader to leave the encounter with a text like mine feeling empowered, feeling that there is room for movement, room to breathe. And as Carlos brought out, the tradition in thinking about the development of the sciences is to say that it's just inevitable, that actually history doesn't matter. Because whatever the particular people, whatever their disagreements, whatever the circumstances, it doesn't really matter. Because eventually the truth, the one truth, will emerge. So there's a sense in which, on the traditional view, scientists aren't that important. Because what one does, someone else would have done the next day. And people are, I quote in the book, were very explicit about this when it came to the rediscovery of Mendel in 1900. I quote an anthropologist in 1917 who says that if it had not been 3 people in 1900, it would have been 6 people in 1901. Right? That's sort of the message, the traditional message about genetics, particularly, is that 1866, Gregory Mendel publishes his paper. The world responds with a big yawn. It's the wrong moment. That's Mendel's tragedy. By 1900, he's dead, but now the world is ready. And now the truth of Mendelian inheritance is irresistible. And it doesn't really matter whether it's De Vries, Correns, or Chermak. It's going to be somebody. Right? Once the times are ready for it, the scientific truths that the world is ready for just emerge. And we all learned this in our textbooks. Every elementary biology textbook tells the story of Mendel publishing in 1866. He dies, obscure, and then in 1900. And so what's the message? The message is that genetics begins with the rediscovery of Mendel's paper. And so the student never questions their own knowledge being framed around the beginning, capital B. That's where genetics began. And so the material I came to at the end of the talk of the alternative history is, I think, all the more the work that it's doing, right? Because the traditional pedagogy always depended on the traditional historiography. Right? The two work well together. And so what I'm learning from these science educators is actually the revisionist historiography helps the alternative curriculum. When people learn that everything they've been taught in school was taught not because that's how nature is, but because a debate that they never heard of ended in one way rather than another, you have their attention. They're interested. They want to know. Well, so I very much see the emphasis on the contingency of scientific knowledge, at least in the case of genetics, as both correct. I think I'm right, but I also see it as healthy. It's a message that is a familiar one within seminar rooms like this one, but it's not at all familiar in the wider world. And so that film I showed you, believe it or not, that film is showing on a loop on the floor at the Exploratorium. And so that notion that actually textbook science sometimes becomes what it is because of accidents in the past. That will be, I think, a surprising message, but also in my experience, and I say this again from having spoken at the American Society of Human Genetics last week, an exhilarating one, because it suggests in a growth mindset kind of way that things can change, things that people never thought of. Many people just take for granted that you start with Mendel's peas. They never imagined that anyone would think differently. And indeed, I sometimes quote a geneticist who wrote just 2 years ago. She wrote a kind of love letter to Mendel. It was Mendel's birthday. It was 200 years from his birth, so he deserved it. But she talked about all the complexity. You brought this out, I heard in your all the ways in which genetic knowledge has become so complex in the post-genomic, epigenetic, microbiomic age that we live in. And she was concerned that her students might be picking up on a deterministic, essentialist message, despite her not wanting that remotely. And yet she says, and I can quote her, "I could not imagine how to teach except starting with Mendel." That's what it's like, right? To grow up in a kind of monoculture. So you need the historian to go back to the moment when people don't need to unthink Mendelism. It's too hard. We just can't do it, even when we want to. But when you go back to a really smart person who didn't have to unthink Mendelism and who saw its limitations and could articulate an alternative, it can be a very powerful stimulus, both for rethinking the past and for rethinking the present. So as you can hear, just as I push back on the book as too Weldonian, I very much, the counterfactual contingentist element is one that's pretty close to my heart. And on the evidence, it seems to go down very well with scientific audiences. They find this exhilarating.
One last thing. You've already shown us that this has put in marcha, how to say that, put in motion different receptions and reflections of what we do in this book. And I think it's important because it's a thick book, and not everybody will be able to read it or will want to read it, although I would recommend everybody to read it. Because, as I said, it's many books. Yeah, it's so my question,
did I hear you say something about it being translated into Spanish, or was that
yeah.
Okay.
I suggested that it will be translated now, so I'm just, but it would be wonderful if it were. But I mentioned that at some point it reads like a novel. Yeah. Like if there's an intrigue and this the climatic moment where Weldon died, and you feel like you want to start crying. And good. So that was a question. Could other products come out of this book, like, for instance, a little shorter narrative, just focusing on the drama, or other alternative products? Of course, the pedagogical, educative branches that you developed there, but you showed us already that they're coming out, the popularization products. So yeah, the question would be, do you feel like you would be doing that, or somebody else, so that among your many collaborators would be doing that? I think it would be important that this very powerful statement and complex in itself can be channelized through different avenues for other audiences.
Thank you for suggesting that and asking about that. The book, as it came out, was actually the result of me realizing the hard way that the book I originally wanted to write was the wrong conception. So I initially thought that this book I wanted to write on the battle over Mendel was going to be my airport bestseller, a trade on the model for me of, if you know it, James Moore and Adrian Desmond's Darwin biography. And I started writing that book, and it didn't work. And it was boring. It was boring, and it was long, and I was fighting to try to say the things I wanted to say. And it took me a little while to realize that it wasn't working, to stand back, to rethink. And so this book is the product of that rethinking. And so it's organized as two sets of essays around a central narrative. And the essays contribute to the narrative, but each of the essays has an argument about Darwin and Mendel in chapter 1, about Galton in chapter 2. And as I saw it, this was me playing to my strengths, such as they are. I know how to write that kind of paper. And there were things I wanted to say about Darwin and Mendel, about Galton. But I love the idea of being structurally adventuresome. So the way that this includes more analytical chapters, especially towards the end, as well as more narrative-driven chapters. And the book ends with 3 postscripts, which are themselves kind of unusual. The first is an essay on the terms genetic determinism and interaction. The second is a demonstration of how, from Weldon's point of view, you can rederive the classic Mendelian pattern. Yellow and green, all yellow, yellow to green in a 3-to-1 ratio, without making Mendel's assumptions. I mean, part of what makes Mendel so attractive and appealing is that you sense that only his explanation could explain that pattern. So to be given an alternative explanation is kind of a powerful thing. And on the Weldonian view, you end up with the green-seeded peas in the F2, containing yellow-making factor. So anyway, and then the third postscript is a fiction.
Yeah.
It's an extract from a counterfactual edition of the Dictionary of Scientific Biography from the world in which Weldon lived 2 years longer. So that's to say, it's very much the book in the end that fitted what I wanted to say. But your point is very well taken. Might there be room for other expositions which reach other audiences that might not be prepared to settle in with a 600-page book? Someone's already sort of written it. One of them, Kostas Kamperakis, my colleague in Geneva, has published a book this year whose exact title escapes me, but it's something like What We Get Wrong About Mendel.
Oh, yes.
And Kostas read my book in manuscript. He was hugely encouraging to me. And his book is a slimmed version of more or less the same message in my book. So I think the two books are being reviewed together. And and his book is really written for science educators. The film that the Exploratorium did is the book, turned into a 3-minute Monty Python style animated film. I think it's brilliant. I wish you'd been able to hear the narration. But that's an example of people with other kinds of expertise looking at the book, figuring out what's most important for their audience, and then running with it. For myself, maybe I should mention that the late Michael Ruse, as he is now, wanted me to do a kind of Cambridge elements in which I spell out what is sort of distributed or maybe implicit in the book when it comes to scientific reason. And I should say that by the end of this year, I'm supposed to submit a chapter for Blackwell's Companion to Integrated History and Philosophy of Science that Yafang Shan is editing on counterfactual history of science. So I've been thinking programmatically about what I want to say about rationality and reality in the light of a more counterfactually engaged historiography, but also agency, as I was saying earlier. So all of that. So I hope that 8,000-word chapter will be a chance to maybe do a little bit of what Michael. But I take it from your remarks. Maybe I should think, about the shorter book, more directed, particularly spelling out the history and philosophy of science interest. But you also said, what about the narrative? The story. So it was great.
It's also very appealing.
So,
bueno, tenemos tiempo para una pregunta de aquí y una de allí. Bueno, dos preguntas o comentarios. A ver, primero levantó la mano.
Thank you very much, Professor Radick.
¿Te puedes acercar tantito? ¿Perdón?
Thank you for your conference and thank you for your great book. I have a question about the concept of gene, because of course now we know that the history of heredity and development is more complex than Mendel thought, but we still have that concept of gene. Genes are not at the top of the hierarchy, for example, but the concept of gene is still there. But thinking about this, we can see, for example, for the splicing and alternative splicing phenomena, or the different functions of a same piece of DNA, or not function at all. Maybe we don't have such clarity about the mere concept of gene, and that concept comes from the Mendelian factors, or elementary, or whatever. So what do you think about that particular problem? We should remain without the concept of gene as that discrete particle. Maybe we have to get rid of that like discrete unity, or from the Weldonian perspective, can we think about a different way to conceptualize genes, not only their part in the full story of development and evolution, but the mere concept of gene? What do you think about that? And thank you so very much.
Thank you. Oh, great question. It's interesting in the current issue of the London Review of Books. There's a long, very thoughtful essay about my book by Lorraine Daston, and she even contributed an hour-long podcast discussion. So you can find all of these on the web right now. And in the podcast, particularly, she shows she's a bit skeptical, as she puts it, that therapeutic history and revised biology curriculum can together change anything important. And so she asked herself in the podcast, well, what would do it? And her answer, which I find very implausible, is linguistic. Maybe we just need to change our terms. I find when it comes to language that I am not very revisionist. I accept that the language is a certain way. For example, with terms like social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is a terrible term in so many ways, but it exists, and it has a certain meaning. And if you kind of don't know what it refers to, you can't follow any number of discussions. And so I think I prefer to accept that the language, we have a language to work with, and it's important to communicate with each other, but we can change the framing in ways that change sort of everything around that. So I'm not as concerned about, as it were, the term gene, and let alone the thought that we need to sort of drive it to extinction. But rather, my hope is that if you change the educational context around gene talk, then when it comes up, it won't trigger thoughts of heredity as destiny. Rather, it will trigger, okay, there's a gene for X. Tell me more. Tell me more about the genetic backgrounds that you've assessed this gene's function against. Tell me more about the wider environments that you've checked out, because that's always in there. It's just usually implicit. So so I would expect that gene talk is pretty much impossible to eradicate. But that's not a big problem necessarily, because you can change what it means. And if you create generations of students, some of whom go on to be scientists, who are instinctively contextual when you bring up genes, then we're already in a different, and I think a better world. And again, if I may, just to finish, the part of my optimism here comes from thinking about other areas of biology where contextual thinking is just not a problem. When it comes to Darwinian natural selection, you can teach little kids, and I've done this, that adaptation is not just an absolute thing, right? A bird is adapted to that particular environment. No one struggles with contextual thinking when it comes to Darwinian evolutionary biology. Or recently, we all lived through the pandemic. The idea that exactly the same microbe can have very different effects in different bodies was not hard for people to understand. So imagine that genetics felt more like biology rather than like mathematical logic when it was taught. And I think the term gene, what it brings to mind, will end up being rather good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Vive.
Okay. Thanks for your talk and for bringing Greg here. It's a real treat to have you in person. I was gonna ask you about scientific controversy as a unit of historical analysis, because as you said, the debate which you study is either unresolved or solved by default. So it's not the standard resolution of a scientific controversy. But I think throughout your talk, you made the case to remove ourselves from framing this in oppositional terms as a scientific controversy. That you actually made the case for thinking about the debate as different strategies for complexity management.
Yes.
In which the epistemic task of one model, shall we say, or one strategy was to reduce complexity, and the other one is to retain complexity. So I want to ask about what the notion then of scientific controversy as the unit of analysis is doing here, because in the film, we come back to scientific controversy.
Yes.
And I think that you've really made the case for removing ourselves from that sort of oppositional framing.
That's very interesting, Viva. Thank you. So there are maybe two quite different things to say. I mentioned this podcast discussion that Lorraine Daston engages in on the book, and she raises some questions about scientific controversy as a unit of historical study. And my own view is that just as I think musicians should feel free to write an opera, a country song, a techno hit, that as it were, all genres should be open and mixable according to what they want to say about a particular topic. I certainly don't think that the only thing that historians of science should write about are controversies. If I look back at my own, set of writings, I've written all kinds of things, but this book is a study of a controversy, and the opposite, the contrast between the two framings, as you nicely brought out in your question. Do we start with complexity and then simplify, or do we start with simplicity and then complexify? That's my analysis of what was at issue between these two opponents. So I don't see that as a kind of standing back from the controversy. It's rather a way of resisting the winner's history view of what they were opposing. So on the winner's history view of the controversy, what was it about? Well, Bateson was right, and Weldon was just thick, as in stupid, or he was jealous, or he was nitpicking, or he was obsessed with statistics.
Or he represented the previous paradigm that was.
He represented the previous paradigm of Galtonian ancestry and was sentimental about that. So there are any number of winner's history ways of characterizing this opposition. And so my way of doing it is, as I reconstruct it, Weldon's way. That for Weldon was what was at issue between them. So yeah, I don't see that as stepping back from the controversy. It's rather reinterpreting what it was actually about in a way that rescues it from the winner's history version.
So you'd still be using the principle of parity as that is built into the methodological principles of controversy to assess Weldon and Bateson.
Yes, very much so. So the principles of that you don't explain why the winning side believed what they did because they were onto the truth, and the losing side believed what they did because they were prejudiced or ideological or sick or stupid or whatever that might be. I've completely absorbed principles of symmetry, and then that leads them to go back to Carlos's earlier question about how do you explain the success of Mendelism? If there's one science which has just been a big success in the 20th century, surely Mendelian genetics has to count. And I argue in the book that we need to bring it down to earth, down to the realm of people who have motivations and agree and disagree, and rather than in the realm of suprapersonal causes. So the idea that the Mendelian gene was summoned forth by some larger forces, and so bringing it down to earth means that concerns with parity can begin to kick in, because then I can say, well, why was Mendelism successful? Because it had a combination of success-making ingredients, namely teachable principles, tractable problems, and technological promise. And having done that, I can, in a symmetry respecting way, ask about Weldon. Had Weldon lived long enough to publish that book, had his considerable number of allies at Oxford built it up in the way that Bateson's allies built up the Mendelian program, what might we have had by way of teachable principles, tractable problems, and technological promise on the Weldonian side? So all of that is me kind of having built into my instincts the sense that one should, to the extent that you can, try to give comparable accounts of both sides.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Bueno, para terminar, les damos la invitación para la próxima y última conferencia del Seminario Universitario de Evolución, Perspectivas Contemporáneas de la Evolución. La charla será el 29 de noviembre de este año en el auditorio de Carlos Gregory de la Facultad de Ciencias y será una mesa redonda sobre evolución y domesticación de plantas y animales. Estará presente el doctor Arturo Argueta Villamar del CRIM de la UNAM y el doctor Eduardo Corona Martínez del Instituto Nacional de Antropología e Historia. Y bueno, en esa mesa también participaré yo y discutiremos en términos tanto históricos como contemporáneos el papel de la domesticación en el proceso evolutivo, cómo se ha usado para construir, discutir a favor y en contra de la evolución y el papel que juega la sociedad que ha jugado en la domesticación de plantas y animales y el papel que tiene la domesticación en nuestras vidas. Bueno, gracias, señor.
¿Ir a comer o qué vamos a hacer?